things. So I'd like to welcome you all here today. We've chosen our subject for today around ADHD. This has been the awareness month for people with neurodiversity. So you've probably seen a lot of things going on around supporting people with neurodiversity and learning differences. The Dyslexia Foundation, ADHD New Zealand have been very busy. So I thought this was a wonderful opportunity for us to focus on celebrating difference in our leadership forum and hear from some of those areas. And I have with me today the ADHD New Zealand, and I'm going to introduce people. We're actually waiting currently, it's most exciting for our CEO, Darrin to come on. As what happens, I'll tell you a little bit of background actually about my work with ADHD New Zealand. Some of you may know that some years ago I was involved with ADHD Rotorua, and we changed the name of ADHD Rotorua to Education and Achievement Association because we wanted to support many of our children who have more than one learning difference. And so because we had children with ADHD, others with dyslexia, and also on the spectrum, we wanted to broaden the organisation. At the time, I was very privileged to work with ADHD New Zealand, and we also started together running a course for parents for children with ADHD. Now, I have with me here today Tracey Rountree. Tracey actually trained with me on that original course, and Tracey has stayed with ADHD New Zealand and has evolved her role and also her work in the course. So I'm going to really look forward to hearing from Tracey today about that. Unable to be with us in person today is Brett Harrington. Brett Harrington is also on the board for ADHD New Zealand, and she has a business, ADHD Sorted. And I've done an interview with Brett, and we're going to hear from Brett around her work with both children and adults around ADHD. And as soon as Darrin is able to come on, we will actually switch to Darryl, I should say. One of the things that often happens when you're CEO of an organisation is you get taken here and there for meetings, and he's actually currently at the Wellington airport. He's going through security. I got a message before, I won't make 3:15, but I will make 3:30. And he will come on and tell us about the exciting things that the organisation is doing before he actually catches his plane. So as soon as he comes on, we will actually cross to Darrin. And they have really been so busy, and we've had the privilege this month of working in all kinds of things, which he will talk about, and Tracey will also share with you. So as Darrin isn't here just yet, I'm going to invite Tracey to start our session. And Tracey has also, since I've been working with her, she's been studying psychology and is completing a degree in this area. Working with ADHD, she also runs seminars for schools, and she has some very exciting things planned in the future as she gets her degree. So I'm really looking forward on an ongoing basis to have the opportunity to work with Tracey. So Tracey, I'm just going to turn it over to you now to make a start. And if you see Darrin coming on, just pause at an appropriate time and we'll get Darrin on before he catches his plane. Sure. Fantastic.
Kia ora, everyone. So as Jenny mentioned there, we first met about 12 years ago. And at that time, I was a desperately struggling parent. I love my now 17-year-old son very much, but primary school and intermediate were both a very traumatic experience for the both of us. So through our journey and our ups and downs, ADHD became my hyper-focus. And then through learning more and realizing how different ADHD is and how different it can look in genders, for example, I realized, oh, Okay, so some of these things are sounding quite familiar, and I actually got diagnosed at 41. So this is now, I've decided, going to be my career. I love it. I'm very passionate about ADHD and promoting knowledge and awareness, because there are so many myths around on what it is. There are so many parents struggling. I'm actually running the ADHD New Zealand Facebook groups. We have one for adults, parents, and also partners. And we have, I think it's about 7,000 members at the moment for the adult group, and over 10 in the parents. And there's a lot of people that are really struggling. So my goal, I'm studying at the moment. I've got a diploma in psychology, and I'm working towards a bachelor's. And my goal is to be able to go out there and to help parents who are really struggling, and to also provide training for anyone, carers, whānau, teachers, social workers, whoever, who are working with people who have ADHD, and generally trying to bust some of those myths. So there is a huge amount of research being done. We have scientific knowledge, methods. We have more technology in terms of performing brain scans, functional MRIs, etc. So we know so much more about what ADHD is. One of the reasons it is so complicated and there's so much misunderstanding is because it's a process. Actually finding someone, a specialist who can diagnose you, because it's so restricted. You can only have a pediatrician or a psychiatrist in terms of being able to have medication prescribed for you. It can take a lot of time, particularly if you're going through the public system. Some parents fight for years to have their children diagnosed. One person with ADHD can look completely different to the next person with ADHD. It's very individual in how those characteristics present. So you have the ADHD, you have personality, you have whānau influence, you have culture, you have your socioeconomic group. There's lots of things that contribute. And ADHD can actually change over time, particularly in girls and from childhood to adulthood. We're not bouncing around. I'm not climbing out windows and doing dangerous things necessarily. I may still be impulsive, but you learn to perhaps sit down and just fidget and jiggle and mentally be busy. There's also a lot of co-occurring conditions. So the process of diagnosis, that's another reason it can take time. You have to be able to rule out other conditions. Is it a hearing issue? Is it something to do with processing? Is it an allergy? Is it another condition such as autism? So there is a whole set of criteria, and there's a whole process that has to be followed. It's not just a matter of, oh, my child's misbehaving, I'm going to go to the doctor and get them to write me a script for medication. It does not work like that. So if you are dealing with families who are going through the process, you do need to be patient and support them and give them time. And I see that we had a guest appearance there from Darrin. Is he still there?
Yes, I am in Wellington Airport. Sorry, I'm late.
So I will pause and hand over to Jenny to hand over to Darrin.
And before you do, I will just do an introduction. Darrin, I was actually just saying how exciting it was that our CEOs now, the work that organisations like ADHD New Zealand are doing is just so important. It's actually taking people around the country. Lately, we've been on international things, we've been on national kind of meetings, and I shared with them how I've had a relationship with ADHD New Zealand over many years, and how exciting it's been to have such a highly active board with so much going on. So it's a real pleasure to have you here this afternoon, and we are aware that you have to catch a plane. So you just let us know when you have to go, but until then, we would love to hear everything that's been happening for ADHD New Zealand.
Thank you, Jenny. And can you hear the announcer behind us?
Only slightly. We can hear you better.
Okay. Brilliant. So first of all, apologies. 45 minutes through security at Wellington Airport really got my ADHD going, to be fair. So I really do apologise. Just to set some context, ADHD New Zealand's been going for 42 years, but about 4 or 5 years ago, when we had membership of like 200-300, we really steered into the fact that nothing is changing in New Zealand. Good intentions wasn't changing anything. So at the then we're known as the ADHD Association. So what we did is we created a brand, ADHD New Zealand. We ran a competition. If you look at our logo, that was designed by a 12-year-old. And we've really stepped into trying to change our New Zealand for the better for ADHD and help our community. And with some fantastic people, we're up to a community which is about 33,000 strong and growing. Now, what we're looking to do is to really have an impact on the lives of New Zealanders. Actually, Tracey, without sounding rude, I don't know if you got the note to stop sharing screen.
Oh, sorry,
so,
no.
And we're doing this in probably 4 key ways. The first is working with adults to help their lives be successful. Now, we know from our own research that 90% of adults with ADHD struggle to get any sort of support and diagnosis. So we're working with the government at the moment and had a really positive hui with them on August the 22nd. It was across the health sector. And I'm 80% confident, barring anything dramatic happening overseas, like another Ukraine, that there'll be a small announcement before Christmas, which will slowly start the process of improving things. We think the work from the hui will take 2 years to implement. And one thing I will say is that one thing that impressed me was across the board, everyone understands how difficult it is if you have ADHD and don't have the support you need. We're really heartened by the response from Pharmac to the College of GPs. The second thing we're looking at is whānau and families and their education journeys. I'm preaching to the community, the converted, sorry, so you would be aware of how difficult it is for someone who's neurodiverse or has learning difficulties, having 2 children in the school system with ADHD. It's a disgrace, to be perfectly frank. Now, I have to be honest, I never would have thought the education sector would be harder to deal with. Excuse me a second. Would be harder to deal with in the health sector, but the education sector is very hard to deal with. So what we are doing, or what we have done, we've started simply because they're the most receptive with the Tertiary Education Commission, and we have created a toolkit that's available for all of New Zealand's universities and vocational training. It's digital, explains what ADHD is, explains the learning difficulties and how universities and polytechs can help them. And that went live 2 weeks ago, and you can access it from our website. The feedback's been enormous and really positive. So much so you may even see the Minister of Education launching it as if it was his idea in about a month. So fingers crossed. Now, what that has enabled us to do is actually really put pressure on the education sector. I think there are 3 phases to this. The first is to create a resource that is easily accessible so people, teachers, SENCOs can understand what ADHD is and the learning difficulties associated. Then it is also to provide access to some resources and tools that they can help. That's all online. And then the second thing we want to do is to then be able to run seminars and webinars to be able to help teachers as we need to. And then the third part is a specialist or an expert coming to a school and doing some training. The obvious missing piece as I talk about it, though, is the actual ministry. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have some dialogue with them, but I'll be honest, I think the schools need this and we're not going to wait. And then the final thing is part of our strategy is to make us viable. We've committed to being digital. It's hard to believe that, 3 years ago we had revenue of about 80,000. We rely on grants and donations. This year we're going to hit 250,000. We're now a tier 3 charity, and now we're aiming to be a tier 2 charity over the next 2 years. And it's only when we get that scale that we can really start making an impact. But small steps, and we've had a lot of small steps. Of the wonderful Jenny and Tracey who you have here, they have helped us along the way, and it's a huge community that's really driven us. And there is a need. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Darrin, for giving us that overview. And I think looking ahead at the direction that we can actually go into. And interestingly, Tracey and I were talking about the numbers of people with ADHD. And in the States now, they're actually talking about 9% even.
Yep.
And New Zealand is really only diagnosing a very small fraction of that. And so
Correct.
for many of us as teachers, we haven't been trained in this area, and yet all of us have people in our classes, not only with ADHD, but other learning difficulties.
Yep.
We've always said it's been 22% of children that don't fit this area, and with, don't fit mainstream education. And with the advent of COVID, and Tracey and I will be talking about this, the numbers are growing. Teachers are telling us that they've got between 40 and 50% of their children now with some learning differences, and they haven't had the training and support to meet those needs. Yeah, so I appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you so much.
It is small steps, and my sister is a school teacher, and I have some understanding of how tough it is to be a school teacher. I've always thought of them as angels. And my son, who they told me wouldn't be able to read beyond the age of an 8-year-old, has 5 days left in his secondary school where he'll leave with NCA 3 in preparation for university. And that is because of 3 or 4 really special teachers along the way.
That's wonderful news. Now, I'm just thinking, before you have to go, there may be some people that have got some questions for Darrin. The Q&A is actually open. If you would like to ask a question of Darrin now, pop that in the chat box before he has to go. How long have you got before you're playing, Darrin?
I actually got about 25 minutes now.
Oh, perfect.
It's just security was the problem.
Yes, that's right. And I was thinking often if security is a problem, then things get delayed, and that means that you've got time before you go through.
Yes.
So if you want to ask an urgent question now before Darrin has to go, feel free to do that. Is there anything in the Q&A already? And we'd rather, I think, use the Q&A rather than the chat box. So that's fine. We'll keep an eye on that. And is there anything else you want to say, Darrin, before we go back to Tracey?
It's all about acceptance, understanding, and believing. That's all it is. It's that simple.
Yes. I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Tracey, we'll turn it over to you, and we'll hear from Darrin with questions afterwards if we have time.
Okay. Lovely. Right, you can see, fine. I always ask that. That's the joys of technology.
Yes, we can see you.
Perfect. And so just the last piece on that slide is there have been quite a few terms related to medical conditions, etc., that we now have in Māori. So the Māori word for ADHD is arorere tene, and I like that so much more than ADHD, and that means attention goes to many things, which is pretty descriptive. So what are some of these underlying differences? What is it about the person with ADHD that is different from someone who is neurotypical or has a normal thinking processing brain? To understand that, we need to look at the fact that there are structural differences in the brain. So it's not a behavioural condition. It's not that they're choosing to misbehave. It's actually a neurodevelopmental condition. There are some areas in the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, that are not as developed. They're immature compared to their peers. And this does catch up over time through the teens to the early 20s. But we have to remember that even for neurotypical people, our prefrontal cortexes don't fully develop until our 30s. So what this means is we need to look at what we're seeing and how these kids are acting and reacting and think about it in a different way. They're not choosing to act and react like this. It's just part of what's going on in their brains. So some of the more obvious weaknesses or deficits, again, we use such awesome terminology to describe these things. So some of the areas where they perhaps need some extra support are to do with executive functioning. So focus and attention, emotional regulation, in terms of being aware of themselves and how they're acting. Being motivated to do things they're not necessarily interested in. Receiving and also being able to communicate themselves to transmit what they want to say. Being aware of time, how long things take. And also their working memory. So that explains why you can teach someone or talk through something and then after lunch they've completely forgotten it. So as well as those structural areas of the brain, there's also a difference with how the neurotransmitters work. So we have them, the main ones impacted are noradrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine. So what's happening is the chemical messengers, our communication within our brain, isn't working correctly. The chemical messengers are not going where they're supposed to in the time frame that they're needed. So we have to think about our ADHD people, our children, as 2 to 3 years behind their peers. And that's a fairly generous estimate. I would say closer to 3. And that's even as teenagers. So how do we deal with these things? What can we actually practically do to help? Now, this is actually something that came from Jenny, and that is taking a multimodal approach. And that's not the medical multimodal approach. It's our holistic approach, where we're looking at a combination of factors. And these things working together and the fact that they're all interconnected will help get the best result and help give our ADHD children and youth the best long-term outcomes. So the first one's medication. And medication is quite divisive. Some people are quite anti it, and especially those who don't have ADHD children or ADHD themselves can be quite judgmental. The thing to remember with medication is that it is very effective for people with ADHD in 80–85%. So with that remaining 15 or so %, it's not as impactful, it's not as effective. And the thing is, pills do not teach skills, to quote the wonderful Russell Barkley, who, if you want any information, check him out. His books are awesome. What medication aims to do is to help our children sit still long enough or focus long enough that they can take the information we're giving them in, so they can actually process it. So it is part of the toolbox. Because you also need, and you can see I've separated them out here. So medication is often that first step with diagnosis. Then we have to look at the social, emotional, and behavioural aspects before we can get to educational. Because until you've addressed these and looked at what's going on beneath the surface, what's happening, why aren't they able to get on or understand what's happening in the class socially? Why is it that they can't seem to control their emotions and their reactions are so extreme? It's not until we get a balance there and work out what's going on that we can focus on the education. And this has been something that I think parents have really recognised with COVID, because we all of a sudden had our children at home and we were trying to teach them. And I think so many people after that experience realised, wow, teachers have got such a tricky job. Because I know with my son, who was like 16, trying to get him to sit down and do something, I felt like I was a diplomat. you know, working with 2 warring governments, because I'd have to cajole and, you know, motivate. And in the end, I used to let him walk around with weights going like this, and I was scribing for him. So Jenny, what about your experiences in those areas?
It has been very interesting, actually, and I've had more parents contact me since COVID around supporting their children with home learning. You always have to look for the silver lining in these things. And I think one of the things that came out of COVID, which is actually going to be helpful for schools, is that parents actually often realise more than they had before that their children had difficulties. And I'm finding that we're getting so many more parents who want to get on board, who actually want to do more about home learning, more about understanding, and develop those partnerships with schools. And I think, you know, we kind of need to capitalise that and on that. And perhaps without COVID, that wouldn't have actually happened.
No. And another good thing, just personally, that I found, because although I have a 15-year-old daughter as well who's not diagnosed with ADHD, but I'm 99% sure she has it. She used to find it really difficult to actually get down all the homework, to follow exactly what she needed, to bring all her books home. So having Google Drive and tools like that have been so helpful for her, and I'm sure children across the board actually, because now they have somewhere that they can go where the resources are. So they're not being left out or left behind for those reasons. So alongside that, it's if you can get into a bit of a partnership and understand what it's like, you know, being a parent of a child with ADHD is incredibly difficult. And sometimes what you see in the classroom is the tip of the iceberg. So that's why Kerry and Jenny sat down and thought, okay, what's currently being offered, though amazing, in terms of like Incredible Years, Triple P, really help with some of those basic fundamentals for parenting. But the thing is, they just didn't go far enough. So what the original Everyday with ADHD parent course set out to do was to create something that recognised the fact that it's hard for people to get specialist appointments in some particular parts of the country where they don't have access. So there are parents and families in crisis, kids in crisis, communities really. So what our program does is it's that step, it's that first step, particularly helpful for those who have just recently got a diagnosis perhaps. Although it's applicable for any ages, the strategies and the ideas behind it are the same. It's basically letting go of some traditional ideas. You can book in, so if you are perhaps dealing with parents who are struggling, this could be an option to give them. It's on the ADHD New Zealand website. It's a 6-week course. It's very reasonably priced, $75 for financial members, and if you're not, it's $115, and that includes a year membership. And what the aim of this particular parent course is to give information, research-backed, the latest information. And this is important across not just home environment, but school environment, is the impact of the environment on our kids. It's actually them dealing with what's going on around them. It's their internal as well as their external environment that they struggle with. Using correct communication and teaching social skills. Talking about family dynamics, relationships, siblings. It's about setting boundaries and positive discipline. Because traditional methods do not work necessarily with our ADHDers, because they're not choosing to misbehave. It's their brain and these underlying challenges. We talk a bit about different learning styles and some ideas on how to start the ball rolling with cooperating with schools, and also some stress and coping techniques, because the goal is whakamana. So it's about empowering parents by giving them some of that knowledge and some different strategies and tools, because we want to get through this protecting the mana of our children. And, you know, speaking as a parent, I used to feel so judged as my child was running off from school and people were trying to catch him, and I'd be going, don't catch him because he might spit at you. Because, you know, I did not teach that to him. I don't run around spitting at people, but that was how he was trying to communicate because he didn't have the words. And so talking to other families that are not going to go, oh, when you tell those stories is also hugely empowering. It's that connection that you know you're not alone. So that is actually one of the most important things about the parent course, is that people have the opportunity to share their experience and they know that they're not alone. It's not just them. So that education, awareness and knowledge also transfers through in terms of education, because anyone who learns about anything really, it just gives you an edge. It gives you more control and more power. So if you're actually finding out about ADHD, it means that you can then look at it in a different way. You're actually reframing it. You understand what some of those different challenges are. So you can look, and it takes away that moral judgment of what these kids are doing, because you're recognizing they're not choosing to be like this, that there's something behind it. And that allows you to perhaps tailor and think about your environment in your classroom and how you can perhaps create one that's more supportive. It can help you then develop strategies to address some of these behaviours that are going on. And that means that, you know, as a teacher, you have more confidence in your ability that you can effectively teach them. And it's not about transferring or handing over power to these kids and changing everything for them. It's just adapting it. It's about equity and giving them the best opportunities to succeed. And it doesn't take that much. It's just the reframing sometimes is enough, because this is really important. What you focus on grows. So if all we're doing is focusing on the things that these kids can't do, the things that they struggle with, then that's what's going to just keep going and developing. So the more we turn it around to a strengths-based learning, which is, I mean, definitely within teaching, I think that is changing. We're definitely becoming more aware of that and focusing on different ways of teaching and different ways of communicating. So before I hand over to Jenny, there's just a couple of things. So first, I would like you to think about what we've discussed today. And in the Q&A, if you could pop in one action once you finish listening to us and finish listening to Jenny and our discussion that you think you could implement in your classroom or work with your teaching staff on. So just thinking of one thing. And Jenny will be picking out one of the answers for a copy of the new book, The Wobbly Kids, A Guide for Parents.
Thank you.
And just finally, sorry, Jenny. So as Darrin mentioned, we're working on funding and developing a program for teachers with resources and ability to perhaps get people in. And I also do workshops either online or around New Zealand, which is an introduction talking about ADHD characteristics and some basic strategies. And also I work with Safe for Children, Donna Buzade, and we do training modules online as well.
Fantastic, Tracey. Thank you so much for that. That's great. It's really...
We also do have one question here, which Tracey may be able to answer.
Great.
Is addressed to Darryl, but Tracey may be able to answer. And will someone be part of the refresh process of the New Zealand Curriculum Framework draft?
Oh, gosh. That is a very good question. And as I don't know if Darrin wants to take that if he's still there, but as he's not, he did mention that it has been quite interesting how those that the ADHD New Zealand has been in discussion with from the health areas have been very willing to come in and meet and chat and discuss what we think is the best way to move forward, but it has been a bit of a brick wall with the education department, I'm afraid. So I know even personally, I have been to a few brainstorming sessions at different centres, education department centres, and yeah, I think perhaps if we all, it's about getting a movement going. So perhaps if we do start bringing these things up, you all bring them up.
I agree.
That if we get a groundswell going, they're going to have to budge, because it can't go on like this, because everybody is suffering. The children, the families, the teachers, the schools, the community. So something needs to be done.
Thank you. If Darren's got anything to add to that, we've got your name, and we can also be in touch. Oh, there's another Q&A there. We've got some webinars coming up, Wednesday the 9th, Tuesday the 15th. Kay, would you like to just explain about that a little more for disabled communities on Te Mātahia? So we'll take that on board, and we'll get Darrin to follow that through and see if we can get some representation there.
That would be awesome. Because again, it's sharing what's out there, because we don't always know, and we're not all connected, and I think that's an issue too. We're very disconnected.
And in fact, that's one thing we've been talking about with the not-for-profit organisations. You know, for us as schools, we've got children with dyslexia, we've got children with ADHD, we've got children with dyspraxia, we've got children on the autism spectrum, we've got children with low literacy, we've got children with English second language. And so if we can actually work together as teams to provide a coherent service for schools to support and to train, that makes, it's so much easier, but we also have that direct access to affect all students rather than just a portion. So, you know, hearing about these things is great. And I'm always willing and keen, actually, to get emails from you around various things that you think that we should take up on. And even for leadership focus, our leadership forums next year will be continuing because we have to lead the change that we want to see in education. And I think that's what you're talking about, Tracey, is we have to get together and work together as teams. So that's fantastic. Keep those Q&A and discussions coming. And I'd like to introduce now to you Brett Harrington. Brett Harrington has also been on the executive of ADHD New Zealand for some time, and she provides services as well. And you may be surprised, and if you don't know already, I also affiliate with having ADHD. And with Tracey has talked about her ADHD. I still haven't had a formal diagnosis, but I am so sure I'm ADHD. And I was 40 before I actually discovered and really understood it. And it took me till I was 40 to become an A student. When you hear from Brett, you will realise she talks about her own ADHD. You heard about Darrin talking about it within his family. And I think the most exciting thing is, and I know that there are teachers who have ADHD and who have dyslexia, and all of us who are embracing our ADHD, we're doing exactly what Tracey talked about. We're working with our strengths, and we have supporting and are addressing our weak areas. And I find so very often that there are many adults who are successful with learning differences and neurodiversity, and those who do know their strengths and use them, and they've supported, you know, their weaknesses or developed their weaknesses. And I think for us in education, that's a lot about what we're doing with children, is helping them to understand their learning differences, their neurodiversity, helping them build their strengths, and then we're supporting them in their areas of weakness. So let's go straight on to Brett and what she has to say, Madeline. I'd like to welcome today to our panel, Brett Harrington. I've had the privilege of knowing Brett for quite some time, but more recently been connected with her in work with clients. And I was really excited to have her on the panel today because of the great work that she is doing. She has started an organisation called ADHD Sorted. and sorted she does. I've had the privilege of sitting in with some sessions with her. And so thank you, Brett, for coming along and sharing with us on the Leadership Forum today.
My pleasure.
So great to have you. So to start with, can you perhaps tell us a little bit about your background and why you started ADHD Sorted?
Well, I realized when I reached a certain point in my life when my kids didn't need me hovering around them anymore, and I needed to find work. And I knew from my background, my personal experience, that there were a lot of types of jobs that were probably available that I wasn't going to ask for because I knew about my ADD. I didn't know a lot about it, but I knew that I had to be careful to avoid certain types of work.
Yes.
And so I went to a counselor and sort of hammered things out a little bit. And I came away from that experience thinking, maybe I'll be an ADHD life coach, and maybe I can learn more about myself and help others in a similar position, which I did. And but as time went on, coaching I think is excellent, and it works extremely well. But I really wanted to work in more of a mental health model, so I went back to school and I got a master's in arts therapy. And thanks to what I understood about ADHD, that was possible. So I sort of combined that experience. The goal was always to work with people with ADHD, and especially students, adults, absolutely, but students, because I was a kid with ADHD, and I had a lot of the experiences, the negative impact that a lot of these kids with ADHD have, and I realized that this isn't necessary. And I really wanted to be there for the kids and their families, just to say, we can do this. Doesn't have to be that hard.
I totally agree, actually. I was one of those kids also. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of the challenges you typically see with the clients you work with, and how do you support them?
So, look, the thing about ADHD is that it can impact people in such a wide variety of ways. For example, for some people, it's not a problem. They have gifts and talents and support, and it's just, they're like, I might have ADD, but I don't really care, which is great.
Yes.
Then there's those who maybe get an assessment and a diagnosis, and they take medication, and that's it. They're good. They're sorted. Okay.
Yes.
The people who come to me may have a diagnosis. They may be taking medication, but there's something else missing. And there's an expression that goes, pills don't teach skills.
Yes.
And so I'm about the skills.
Yeah.
And so the people who come to me are still having a hard time. Well, what I call it, making their intentions match their outcomes.
Yes. Yeah, so important. Your sessions often include an understanding of brain differences. And can you describe for us some of the brain differences that are going on for people with ADHD?
When I'm working with a client with ADD, I'm aware that we may be working with three things at once. So, for example, it's very likely, it's not universal, but it's quite likely that the person will feel somehow like they're a bit different. And this will impact their confidence. And confidence is important to learning. I'm always questioning my spelling. I'm also dyslexic, so if that looks really wrong to you, let me know and I'll fix it. There's also this disability, and this is a tricky one because it's invisible. We can't see it. And the only reason why we know something might be amiss is because things get missed, things get dropped, things don't happen as expected. And but what we found out, Jenny, is that with some knowledge, just a bit of knowledge, and some acceptance that this is a real thing, this ends up being relatively straightforward and easy to deal with, because we have plenty of tools, some really good strategies and we understand how to use them, and that's important.
Mm.
And some really learnable skills. We can make this disability pretty much a non-issue. But the thing we have to understand, if this person has this underlying disability, and when I say a disability, when it comes to doing certain things a certain way, and for
Yes.
students in school, they will absolutely be expected to be doing things a certain way. And that is sometimes where the problem comes in. And if, as a result, they feel like they're different and maybe they lose confidence, there's bound quite naturally going to be a follow-on psychological impact. And that's often
Yes.
some anxiety. This is extremely common, especially in girls. But then there's this other thing, which is important for educators to be aware of. And this is called rejection sensitive dysphoria. And dysphoria simply means unhappiness. So these individuals will be highly sensitive to situations in which they may feel criticized or rejected. So whether this is due to the disability, the dysregulation of emotion that comes with this disability, or if it's a trauma to our sense of self, our confidence, I go with a little of both.
Yes.
Okay. So in a nutshell, I think of ADHD as a struggle to make our intentions match our outcomes. And for a lot of the learners that we see, they have all the right intentions. They intend to make mom and dad proud, to do as the teacher wants, and to have those good outcomes, those good marks. And I often can't figure out why it's not happening. And left untreated, these same learners can adopt an I don't care attitude. Okay, and that's a you know, a response. That's a coping mechanism.
I understand. Yes.
So often from here, if you like, Jenny, I can talk about a little bit more about what's going on in this ADHD brain. Would that be helpful?
That would be very helpful, because I think a lot of our listeners are supporting teachers as well that they work with to have greater understanding. So that background would be very helpful.
Okay, excellent. So what we need to understand is where we have, we could call it ADHD, or just a general sort of neurodiversity.
Yes.
Or sometimes with a lot of these learners, we may not know, we may not have a diagnosis, but we may know that there's some adversity going on in this person's life. And so they're struggling a bit. Okay, so there's that difference. And sometimes we may not be able to put a name to it. But if you know you have a learner with good intentions who do want to do well, and it's just not happening for them, it can be really helpful to just sort of ask yourself, is something going on here? Because ADHD, and this is really important to point out here, in and of itself, this is not a character problem. Okay, so the analogy I use is, you know, I wear corrective lenses, and everyone seems to be able to accept my eyes don't focus at a certain distance, and there's no expectation that if I tried harder, you know, I could overcome this without my glasses. So there are certain kinds of functioning this brain simply doesn't support, and including these brains will have a really sketchy sense of time. For example, how long is something going to take? How much time has gone by? Things like that. Combine that with some pretty dodgy short-term working memory. So short-term working memory is an ability to hold a goal in mind over time despite distractions. Okay. This brain is going to struggle with this. So for example, you know, if you give an assignment to a student and they're super keen, they're inspired, they want to do it. Okay. And you say, okay, that's done in 2 weeks or something. It's very likely that this student, by the time they left your classroom, will have kind of forgotten this. They will have forgotten it, and they won't have much of a concept of when that's due. The other thing we don't have going on very well is what's called perspective memory. Come on, pen. And I'll explain what that is. So the neurotypical brain supports the individual's perception or memory that, based on past experience, now may be a good time to start a task because it's going to pay off later to do so. This is an ability to factor future consequences into current action. These brains will struggle with this. Brain does not support it. And the reason why is because the other thing this brain is getting supported is the emotions. Sometimes they're too much and sometimes they're not enough. The other piece here is what's called the brain's natural reward system. And what comes from that simply is dopamine. So this brain is not getting a pre-task initiating boost of dopamine that would allow it to initiate a task early. In other words, it's not getting motivation. Motivation is an emotion and we're not getting it. Now, I've left off an incredibly important piece here that I'm going to sort of pause here and make a big deal about. What's missing in these ADHD neurodiverse brains is what's called executive function. So executive function is our highest order thinking, right? It allows us to be able to manage time. It allows us to have good short-term working memory. It allows us to prioritize and organize our tasks. So this is the, so ADHD is a developmental neurological delay, which means that this highest level of development neurologically, this is what is kind of not quite up to snuff.
Yes.
So when I'm working with my clients, the first thing I ask them to consider is practicing awareness. And that's that ability to step back from what we may be doing or not doing and just notice, what is my brain occupied with? And what am I doing physically with my body? Am I stuck? Am I running around? And what are my emotions? Because they are going to impact all behavior. And if we've struggled a lot with making our intentions match our outcomes in life, and we've struggled with time and short-term working memory, and people have gotten cross with us because it looks like, we're not paying attention, okay? It's very normal that we will use self-judgment as a means of trying to improve ourselves. We might feel guilt, and we may feel shame. And this is the idea that somehow or another there's something wrong with my character. And it's really important to understand how this, is quite a blow to self-confidence. And all this causes stress. Stress causes that stress chemical cortisol. And according to the experts, cortisol cancels dopamine. So when we get hard on ourselves, when we beat ourselves up, this is quite literally a brain drain. It's not helpful and it's painful. So we will try to escape this. But if we escape it and quickly, chances are we won't learn much and we may just repeat these mistakes again. So what we want to do, as I call it, coming over to the dopamine side of the equation and see all the question marks? We need to get really curious. What's going on with this learner? If they have those good intentions and it's just not happening, what's happening for them? Okay. With a healthy dose of compassion. Look, they didn't ask for this and they weren't going to overcome it simply on will alone any more than I can overcome my myopia with will alone. Okay. Dr. Barkley, the psychiatrist and researcher in the US, says this is not a trivial disability. I call it an intention ruiner. Okay, so these kids deserve our compassion. And if we can look at their situation with curiosity and compassion, this is going to be a brain gain. It's less painful. It's less upsetting for everyone. if we do it this way. And, you know, in that context, we're going to be more likely to say, okay, what do we need to do to make this easier and simpler for this learner? And by no means does this mean do we, you know, dumb this down, God forbid. Okay. A lot of these kids are incredibly intelligent. You know, sometimes making it easier means speeding it up, honestly.
Yes.
So we have to know the child. There's your curiosity. We have to look at them like they have good intentions, because they probably do. It's very likely that they do. And, you know, and figure out, how do we make it easier and simpler for this learner?
Yes, the work you're doing, it's so exciting. And when I had the opportunity to sit in, we talked a little bit earlier about the multimodal approach, and sort of the medical side of it involves the diagnosis, and it may or may not involve medication. But there's also a social, emotional, and behavioural component. And I find that so very much the case with our work is that often the medical get sort of addressed, but the social, emotional, behavioural doesn't get addressed. And what I like so much about your work is it really focuses in on that area to support the young person to understand themselves and make change, but also to support the adults that are working with them to do the same. And I think what you've outlined here is just, you know, such an important process. So I really appreciate you showing that. So who gets the benefits from working with you in terms of what kind of age groups?
Okay, I'm going to stop this share, and because I probably won't do any doodles about that. Look, people ask me, who do I work with? And I say I work with the willing. I've worked with kids as young as 7 or 8. That's more unusual, but sometimes you have that kid and you just know they just need to understand what's going on for them. And once somebody can explain it to them, normalize it, and maybe go, yeah, I know what it's like. I really do. It's hard, you know, but this is how we can work with it. You know, right through, you know, all age groups.
Great. And you see a lot of adults as well, don't you?
I do. And I've seen people from all walks of life. I just worked with a gentleman recently. I don't think he mind my talking about him. He struggled in school, Jenny, like we did.
Yes.
And it wasn't until he took a psychometric test after leaving school, and he went to his, you know, the supervisor who proctored the test, and the fellow said something to him about, so what do you plan to do with your life? And he didn't know. And apparently the gentleman said, oh, you don't know who you are, do you? Apparently his psychometric test proved that he was extremely intelligent, but that's not the message he got in school.
Yes.
And here he was, he's retired now, and he's done great things, but he was coming to me to find out about ADD.
Yeah, fantastic. I read a really interesting article yesterday. It was actually on Facebook, and it was actually talking about in Australia, but I know that this is very true for New Zealand, that a lot of older people are really just starting to discover that they have ADHD. And they were talking in this article particularly about women that haven't been diagnosed with ADHD, and it's often the inattentive type that we go through school. And I'm finding very much that the children that I'm working with, their parents are discovering their own neurodiversity at the time that we're diagnosing their children. And I think that's very helpful for us to know in education as well, because there is that hereditary component. And, you know, we've got those things happening in families. And I know I've been sending new clients, and I've had parents and children, you know, working together. And it's fantastic that, you know, we can all do this understanding and this learning together. Yes.
Again, I asked the parents the same thing. Start with that curiosity and compassion with yourself. You know, if you find yourself getting frustrated with yourself, you know, feeling, you know, beating yourself up a little bit because something didn't go according to plan, bring in that curiosity and compassion to yourself. What's hard about this? How can I make this easier? If the parents can bring that kind of attention and awareness to themselves, they will automatically bring it to their children. And now they're working together. There isn't that
Exactly.
conflict, you know?
Yes.
Now
Yes.
they're coming up with different ways to do things. ADHD is not a reason not to do things, but it may
No.
be a reason to do things differently.
Fantastic. And it's really interesting, you know, like you were based in Auckland, and in sort of days gone by, we'd have to either travel to Auckland or be in Auckland to get your services. But now, of course, you actually are able to work on Zoom, and so many more of us are used to sort of these kinds of platforms. So how can people refer to you?
I have my website, ADHD Sorted. That's, I think if you Google that, it'll come right up. Contact me, and I will send you. I've got a booking app, because that kind of cut down on some of the admin mistakes
Yes.
a little bit.
Yes.
And people can book themselves in.
Yes, thank you. And we will be supplying the recording for our leadership forum to our members. And so you may find that people are watching it in the future and they say, I heard about you from the leadership forum. So I really thank you for being part of that, the discussion today. And if we do happen to see you for our Q&A session, that will be fantastic. But otherwise, I'd really like to sort of just, your input today has been really great, and you've brought together a perspective to the panel. So
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care, Jenny. Thank you.
Great. And I think you'll probably agree with me, listening to different people speaking about ADHD, we're starting to really bring together a team approach and to be able to offer services to families and increasingly towards schools. So I would just like to bring together today some of the aspects for us as teachers and as leaders. And I think it would be fair to say, we've talked about this before, that many of us feel that we weren't trained to meet the needs of various people with learning differences. We were actually trained in mainstream education, and our job has been made even harder in the last 2.5 years with the number of students we have that are having learning differences and neurodiversity. And part of that becomes, as our awareness grows, we're actually diagnosing increasing numbers, but also people are saying that particularly around with COVID, we've had much more anxiety happening in children, in families, stress on families, and that has resulted in stress on us as teachers. And it is actually, New Zealand has been renowned for diagnosing 2.5% of children with ADHD, and we tend to diagnose the hyperactive type rather than the other types. We've actually got 3 types of ADHD, as you heard my colleagues mention, the inattentive type, and there is also a mixed type. And I'm actually really concerned about the mixed type in education, because I think many of our mixed type, they're on our behaviour registers. And often we see things as a behaviour problem, but it's often an undiagnosed or an unmanaged ADHD. And we're actually taught as teachers that if a child can perform one day or behave one day, but then they don't another, then that's actually a choice that a child makes, and it's an option. So if they can behave and they choose not to, then that's a behaviour problem. Now, with what Brett actually said around, we understand now that ADHD is a chemical imbalance in the brain, and some days your chemicals are more imbalanced than others. And I actually have children who say to me that when they wake up in the morning, they actually know if it's going to be a good day or not. And so this effect of the chemical imbalances on the brain are important. And I also find, even myself, if I don't have proper breaks, if I don't have proper meal times and I'm tired, these things actually get worse. And I know, so for so many of our children, learning makes them tired. And so even simple things like making sure that they've got enough food, that they get enough rest, because even having ADHD often means that you have trouble sleeping at night. So all these things bring us to the importance of supporting our teachers. And to be honest, I actually feel very sad about what we're being asked to do in schools, because more and more we've got increasingly more students who've got difficulties dealing with mainstream education. And we're expecting schools, the leadership teams and the teachers to deal with these students, and they still actually haven't had the training. So it's music to my ears to hear that organisations like ADHD New Zealand are working on that they've got funding for it to provide us with more resources and more expertise, because there are few people who've got the skills and the knowledge to sort of help with the ADHD and the neurodiversity. And there is a number of benefits that we have to addressing those needs. So we talk about the learner waves model, and if we look at the third wave here, I include ADHD in the third wave, partly because many of our children have other learning difficulties to go with their ADHD. And so the remediation that you want to put in is the same as some of these other things. And whilst we're saying that, it could be between 7.5% and 9.5% of children actually have ADHD, but we only diagnose 2.5%, we've got all these other children to actually cope with as well. So very much the work that I do is how can we meet the needs of all the third wave. And the exciting thing is that the research is actually showing that when we meet the needs of this student group, whether it's ADHD or whether dyslexia, we'll actually be meeting the needs of all of those students. And so that's very exciting for us. We've talked about in the past how our children have underpinning cognitive weaknesses around the auditory, the visual, the gross and fine motor skills, and the phonological awareness. And if you have ADHD, you've heard today that the short-term working memory is further impacted for children with ADHD, along with their organisational skills and their attendance. And I've also included processing here, because this is actually an interesting one. Most of our children with learning difficulties have processing delays, but often with ADHD, their processing is too fast. And if you process things quickly and you don't attend to detail, you have problems with things like comprehension and tuning out. So with that processing speed, it might be too fast or it might be too slow, but nonetheless, it's a processing speed issue. We've mentioned about the hyperactive, the inattentive, and the mixed type. And I believe in the 2.5% that we've diagnosed in New Zealand, this is the group that we tend to diagnose the most. The children that are sort of out there, their behaviour difficulties, they make it very challenging in the classroom. These children fail silently, and it's interesting, you've heard from 3 women today, and we were more the inattentive type. Darrin didn't actually say which type he was, but very often, and I do have some boys who actually are the dreamy boys and who fly under the radar, and they often don't cause us challenges in the classroom, so we don't even think that they might have an ADHD problem and that they're tuning out from learning. And then this mixed type are the kids who are there, behaviour and inattention is more prevalent some days, and other days they're actually more inattentive. So we've got those both types. So as teachers, there is just a number of impacts to us in the classroom. And there's actually a huge cost to not providing training and support. And that's why it's so sad when we hear that the ministry that perhaps hasn't really come to grips with this, because you know yourself, and I can recall some days when I was mainstream classroom teaching, there were some days that challenging behaviour in the classroom was so stressful. You know, the stress levels for us as teachers, how do you deal with the situation? I've been in rooms where I've been observing, I can recall, a child throwing chairs, and, how do you manage with the rest of the class when you've got a child throwing chairs? How do you manage with children who are screaming because something's happened and they don't know how to deal with it, and you've got a whole class? So for us as teachers, we're spending time on behaviour management and trying to sort out these things when we actually haven't got the skills. And it's taken me a long time to get the skills, and that's understanding my own ADHD. I've also got one child who has grown now, but with dyslexia and ADHD. And I've spent the last 25 years becoming a specialist in this area, and now working with schools and supporting teachers in schools. And if I still struggle, and there are days where I think, oh my goodness, this one's a tough one, how is that for teachers? So that whole classroom tone and the student well-being is affected. And I know I have parents coming who say they've got children in their classes, you know, their children have children in their classes with ADHD, and it really affects them. Some children are sensitive, they actually can't handle these situations, and the impact to all of the students, you know, but particularly those who don't have learning needs. You know, the time that we spend on behaviour management and the time that we spend on dealing with these situations impacts the achievement of all of our students. So we've got that reduced achievement. And we've all said that over the last 2.5 years, there's a lot more stress for us as teachers. We've got an increased workload, not only as a result of this, but as a result of the, you know, COVID and the attendance issues, the motivation of students, the engagement of students, and the challenge that we're having to work in forms of different modalities. Are we doing online learning? Haven't got the parent support or the people coming into schools that we've had to help us because of that. So these are the ways that we actually have to, regardless of who helps us, and Darrin made a very good point, is that we can't wait to see who is going to jump on board with us. We actually have to do this ourselves. And so I want to leave you with today 3 key tips for supporting success. And some of our children have to move. And in fact, if you've got ADHD, it's really hard for you to sit still. You'll notice some children shake their legs while they're learning. Other children are fiddling with things, and they often can be disruptive. Now, the reason that they do this, that they want to move, is Brett was talking about dopamine. But when children move, a chemical is released in the brain that aids concentration. So these children's bodies are actually telling them that they need to move to help their concentration. Now, what I say to children is that we have a right to move, but we also have a responsibility. We actually have to move in ways that don't disrupt other children and aren't noisy and distractive. So I often, as a teacher, I will seat my children with ADHD at the front of the class and at the side. The reason for that is that when they're at the front, all the stuff that's going on behind them doesn't distract them. And if they're at the side and they need to move, they can actually get up and just walk up and down without actually distracting the rest of the class. I also give them things like blue tack. Blue tack is not noisy, and you can actually fiddle with blue tack while you're listening, and it gives them that sensory that they need to help their concentration. And the other thing I've done is, you know, Velcro, not the rippy bit, but the rough bit. You can glue a piece of Velcro at the bottom of their desk, and they actually just fiddle with it. And the rough part of it gives them the stimulation that they need to help concentration. But I've found that we have given children those balls to sit on, the movement balls. But I found you can get children, if you've got 3 of those in your class, you can get children bouncing like kangaroos. And I find it really hard to even teach with those things going on. So it's actually choosing, resources for the children and giving children that responsibility. But if we stop them moving, we actually make it worse. And so having this piece of knowledge is important. The next thing I talk to children about is brain types, and an analogy that the children love. I actually often say to the children, especially boys, do you like fast cars? And I say, what's the best car you like? And it often comes up with a Ferrari. Somebody told me about a Tuatara the other day, which apparently is the fastest car in the world. And I get all this description. Well, I say you have a brain that's like a Ferrari. It goes at 100 miles an hour. And that's really good, that kind of brain. Sometimes if we're brainstorming, if we're problem solving, if we're doing art, we want our Ferrari brains. But at other times, if we're doing silent reading, we're doing writing, or we're doing maths, we might want our structured, organized brains. And those brains, do you know what a Mini Cooper is or a Mini is? And often they know what a Mini is. That's a mini brain. And both are good brains. And for us, the Ferrari brains, we need to learn how to use our Mini Cooper brains. And those Mini Cooper people, they would be good to develop some Ferrari skills and some Ferrari brains. And in the class, I will actually so often stop children and I will say, what's the brain type that we're using at the moment? And so those who've gone off on the wrong brain type, they will be relating it to the task that they're doing and switching back to the other side of their brain. And I find that is really useful because it helps children understand their learning differences, but it gives them a tool for being able to connect and have those right brains. And that's why I failed at school, because my Ferrari brain was always doing something else when it was supposed to be a Mini Cooper brain. And I didn't even understand about those Mini Cooper skills. And it took me till I was 40 to figure them out. And once I knew, it was instant. You know, I became an A student in the module on this that I'd missed through school. The last tip that I would like to give is how do we improve attention and focus? And I do this with all the class, not just the children who have learning difficulties. I think we can all do with improving our listening skills and our attending skills. So I talk about some people are distracted by auditory things. People who do a lot of talking, noises in the classroom, noises outside the classroom, they're drawn to them. Other people are distracted by people moving around. If someone's in the playground out the window or the caretaker's mowing the lawn, everything that they see distracts them. Other students are, and you can't see this, it's invisible, are distracted by their own thoughts. And this has happened to me a lot. I might be listening to whatever's going on at university or whatever, focusing on the job, and suddenly an idea pops into my head and I find myself thinking about other things. This happens to children with ADHD all the time, and we don't even know that it's going on. So what I do is I give children maths counters, red, blue and yellow. And I say, I want you to all to start noticing. Every time you go off task and it's something you heard, I'd like you to put out a red counter. When you go off task and it's something you saw, I want you to put out a blue counter. And when you go off task with an idea that popped into your head, put out a green counter. And I start observing how many counters are going out and what colours they are. And then we actually coach the kids individually. And again, we're building their knowledge and awareness and understanding. And it's a teaching process for the whole class. And I've really found that is helpful. And so those are just 3 key tips that I feel that will sort of give you an instance that knowing a little bit more about and perhaps that you can employ. So we've talked a bit today about teacher knowledge. Accommodations are anything that you do to make a child's life easier. Skills and strategies are anything that we teach to make improve the problem that a child might have. Brett talked about those, Tracey talked about those. And I think for us as leaders, many of you here and who are going to be listening to this are SENCOs, you're also learning support coordinators, your RTLB. Our role, how can we develop a school policy and then provide leadership training to help our teachers to develop this knowledge? And I think really as leaders in our schools, that's the focus that we're wanting to work with. Okay, so Tracey asked you a question before, and those of you who are on the call, if you would like to pop in the chat box now, what's one thing that you're going to take away from today that you can either implement tomorrow in the classroom or that you can help your teachers implement? So if you could put that in the Q&A now. And also, if anybody's got any questions for the panel, Tracey can answer any questions for ADHD New Zealand. And if we don't know the answers, we'll certainly find out for you. So we will give you some time to do that. Great. So was there anything, while they're just doing that, Tracey, is there anything, parting thoughts that you would like to finish with?
It's been very interesting. I mean, I really like the way that Brett describes it as well. And you know what it's like whenever you hear other people talking, you say, oh, I meant to say that. Oh, yes, because we have so many amazing thoughts in our head that we try and get out there. And I think it was a key point that she'd made as well, with ADHD being an invisible disability.
Yes.
So we often have those expectations that we put on these kids because we can't see those differences.
Yes.
But the way that they're acting sticks out like a sore thumb. So really keeping in mind that developmental delay. Just say 3 years. It's 2 to 3 years normally. So it's about adjusting our expectations. And then that's part of that reframing to look at what's going on behind it. What things are happening that are causing emotions? You know, is it something that's happened socially? Have they misread social cues? And then it's about empowering them by giving them the tools as well, and taking a very collaborative approach, I think. You know, actually talking to them. What do you think might help you? Or if this comes up again, what do you think would be a better way to deal with that?
Yes.
And actually go through it and start teaching some problem solving skills. And I love what you were talking about with having the counters and getting them to start being aware of what's going on inside their brains, because that's a skill that is going to be so incredibly helpful. And I think I know from being a parent, because I was watching just about every single thing that my children were doing, I got to know them really well. And I think sometimes, you know, the parent of a special, you know, our special complex children, we do get to know them so well. And so we can see underneath that behavior, and we still love them. Whereas, you know, when you're a teacher, you don't know all those beautiful things about them, perhaps. So look for some of those nice things, get to know them, ask them questions, build a relationship.
Fantastic.
And I think that will help.
Great. Awesome. Now, I thought I should just actually mention, many of you will have seen my book, The Wobbly Kids for Teachers, and I'm actually wondering, we didn't actually introduce that this book is actually The Wobbly Kids for Parents. And I ended up writing this book this year, actually, because of the need that came out of COVID and all the parents that I had contacting me. So this book is actually a guide for parents how to grow great children with learning differences, how to work with schools, and how to support them at home. And the book has actually just come off the printing press this week. And so that's why we thought that we would give away the Wobbly Kids for Parents. And so those of you that have got the Wobbly Kids for Teachers, you may like to have a copy of this book. And I can see we've got a person actually in the chat box. So if you would like to, the chat is disabled. Okay. So what about the Q&A? Is that
Q&A's
disabled?
there.
Q&A is there.
Yeah, I think it's from Kay.
Yes.
And Kay loves the fidgets that are suggested. Fantastic. So anyone else?
Put something. Yes, I was going to say.
Yeah, just put something in, or even your name in the Q&A, and then we can include you for the draw. But I hope that you have enjoyed the session today, and those of you who will be listening on the recording. I've had so many people contact me and say they've got meetings on that they couldn't attend, and they will be listening later. And I've also wanted to share with you that we had been talking about the Leadership for Change program, and I have the first round of schools starting Leadership for Change in the next few weeks, but the applications are going to be open all this term for the start for next year. And of course, we've been talking about, with the Leadership for Change program, it's about providing all the training for leaders, for teachers, for teacher aides, and also for parents to be part of the program that actually needs that change. So if you want to just email me about that, just to find out a bit more about your schools. I've also written to the Coles, and I'm spending this week following up with the Cole leaders about talking about Kahuiako actually coming on the program as well. And I've got a couple of schools interested. So I think there's somebody else there. Cheryl plans to revisit the seating arrangements, and she also loved the idea of the blue tack. So that's fantastic. And I'd actually like to just say, Madeline, I'd like to give a book to both of the Tracey and who was the other person? I can remember her surname, Henare?
Of Kay.
Kay.
Okay.
Tracey and Kay. Kay, do we know which school you're from? Maybe pop your school in the chat box so that we can get it. I know which school Tracey is from.
Sorry, it was Kay and Cheryl.
Cheryl.
Sorry, Kay and Cheryl. I've got my Tracey, and you look a bit alike, actually.
Oh.
So lovely to have you, and we'll leave it there for today, and we'll look forward to seeing you for our last session in November. And thank you very much to ADHD New Zealand for your participation and your sharing today, especially Tracey and Darrin, who is now probably in the clouds somewhere, and to Brett for doing the interview with us. Thank you so much.